These stories weren't just for entertainment, they served as cautionary tales, explanations for the unknown, and a way to enforce societal norms. But what's really chilling is how these age old legends have shaped the horror genre that we love today. So grab a flashlight and lock your doors. Let's explore the horrifying myths that have stood the test of time. Now, we all know vampires, right? If you've seen horror movies or you're in any way familiar with the horror genre, you've probably heard of Dracula or even Interview with the Vampire, and unfortunately, maybe even Twilight. There's some charming, some monstrous vampires, but pretty much all of them are immortal blood drinkers. But did you know that the idea of the vampire as we know it today comes from a much older, much terrifying creature, the Strigoi? Now, before we sink our teeth into the origins of these nightmarish beings, let's break down exactly what a Strigoi is. They come from Romanian folklore. These creatures are said to be restless spirits, either of the dead who have risen from their graves or of the living, cursed individuals born with strange traits that mark them as something unnatural. People believed Strigoi had supernatural abilities. They could shapeshift, become invisible, and most horrifying of all, they drank the blood of the living. Unlike the elegant vampires of modern fiction, Strigoi were grotesque and feral. They were corpses that crawled out of the grave at night, terrorizing villages, draining their victims, and leaving entire communities in fear. So where exactly do these legends come from? The fear of the dead returning was so real in Romania that people took extreme measures to prevent it. If someone was suspected of becoming a Strigoi, their grave was exhumed, their heart was completely removed, and their body was burned or staked through the chest. Sometimes they even put garlic or nails in their mouths to stop them from feeding. So why did they do all these precautions? Well, there were real-life cases that actually fueled the myth. Stories of mysterious deaths in villages, people who were seen alive after their burials, and unexplainable illnesses. All of these were blamed on the Strigoi. Now, like I said before, if you're a horror fan, you've seen traces of the Strigoi everywhere. One of the biggest influences is in Bram Stoker's Dracula. While Stoker's vampire is often linked to Vlad the Impaler, the truth is, the blood-drinking habits and supernatural nature align far more with the Strigoi of Romanian legend. And it doesn't stop there. The idea of vampires as grotesque, corpse-like creatures with monstrous hunger shows up in movies like Nosferatu and 30 Days of Night. Even Guillermo del Toro's The Strain directly pulls from Strigoi mythology, depicting them as terrifying parasites that turns humans into mindless, bloodthirsty creatures. Also, in the video game realm, there's been tons of inspiration. Games like The Witcher, Castlevania, and even Skyrim. They all incorporated Strigoi-inspired vampires, even though giving them a more animalistic, horror-driven aesthetic compared to the romanticized versions that we often see. So let's break this down. How are Strigoi different from today's vampires? Well, Strigoi aren't aristocratic. They're cursed, revenant-like beings. They actually don't need an invitation to enter your home. If you're unlucky enough to be on their list, they'll find you. And unlike modern vampires, which can sometimes be charming or seductive, Strigoi are purely monstrous. They exist only to hunt and consume. They're a chilling reminder of how folklore shapes horror. They may not be as famous as Dracula, but their influence is undeniable. From ancient Romanian villages to today's horror films and video games, their legacy continues to endure anything. Now let's sink our teeth into the legend of the Nosferatu, the grotesque plague-bringing vampire of Slavic folklore. You might know the name, of course, from the recent movie Nosferatu, but did you know that the legend behind the creature is far older and much more terrifying? The word Nosferatu itself is actually shrouded in mystery. Some say it comes from the Romanian word Nuciferet, which means insufferable or plague bringer. Others claim it's an archaic term for undead or demonic. But regardless of its origins, in Slavic folklore, the Nosferatu was not your suave, well-dressed Dracula. It was a monster. Unlike the elegant vampire of Victorian literature, the Nosferatu was more akin to a walking corpse, bloated, decayed, rat-like, and absolutely terrifying. It was believed to rise from the grave due to improper burial rites, also a violent death, or even as punishment for wickedness in life. But the worst part? This creature didn't just suck your blood, it spread disease, bringing entire villages to ruin. The traditional Slavic beliefs held that the only way to stop a Nosferatu was through brutal means like staking its heart, decapitating it, or burning the corpse to ashes. Because if you didn't, well, let's just say that your entire family might not wake up the next morning. Now let's forward to 1922, when the world was first introduced to Nosferatu on the big screen. The silent film Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, gave us one of the most iconic vampire portrayals of all time, Count Orlok. Unlike the seductive Dracula, Orlok was grotesque, bald, hunched, elongated fingers, and soulless eyes. His mere presence was enough to induce nightmares. And it was intended to adapt Bram Stoker's Dracula. Copyright issues unfortunately forced him to change the name, but in doing so, he accidentally created something far more terrifying. Because Orlok wasn't just a vampire, he was the personification of pestilence, creeping into towns and leaving only death in his wake. This idea of the vampire as a plague bringer came straight from the Nosferatu legends of Eastern Europe. And let's be real, Count Orlok is still one of the creepiest vampires in horror history. Now, the Nosferatu legend didn't stop with Orlok. It slithered its way into countless horror stories, films, and even pop culture. Take a look at Salem's Lot. The character of Kurt Barlow, especially in the 1979 and 2004 adaptations, he looks nearly identical to Count Orlok. Bald head, piercing eyes, needle-sharp fangs. And he's not a charming nobleman either. He's a beast. He's a predator. Then you look at 30 Days of Night, a film that takes the Nosferatu concept and dials it up to 11. Feral, animalistic vampires hunting in perpetual darkness of an Alaskan landscape. Even Buffy the Vampire Slayer took some inspiration from this legend with The Master, the show's first big bad villain. He bore more resemblance to Nosferatu than to Dracula. And let's not forget, of course, The Strain, Del Toro's modern take on vampirism, where vampires are less seductive and more like terrifying parasites. So the Nosferatu-style vampire, it's persisted for one reason. It taps into something primal. It's not about seduction, it's not about romance. It's about drilling fear, pure, unfiltered fear, into the hearts of many. So the reason why Nosferatu still haunts us is because it represents something deeper than just a monster. It's a reminder of the unseen terrors lurking in the dark, whether that be plagues, death, something ancient and unrelenting. There's no stake or sunlight that can truly destroy it. Whether it's in folklore, silent film, or modern horror, one thing's for certain, Nosferatu is eternal. Now, the Upir? Well, they're a little different. These are ancient mythological creatures that hail from Eastern Europe, especially in Slavic regions. They've haunted folklore for centuries. And trust me, their creepy characteristics have shaped much of what we know about vampires today. So what exactly is an Upir? Picture this, a pale, bloated corpse that refuses to stay buried. Unlike the vampire we often think of, who drinks blood to stay alive, their specialty was something a lot darker. It was believed that they drained the life essence, the very soul, from its victims, often leaving them empty and lifeless. Sometimes it even took the form of a human being, only to transform into a more monstrous entity when it was ready to hunt. And like any self-respecting monster, the Upir wasn't immune to certain weaknesses. We've all heard about vampires being repelled by garlic or holy symbols like the cross, but these guys? Well, if you're unlucky enough to cross paths with one, you better pray you had a stake nearby, or maybe even a shovel. You see, they were known to rise from the grave, and if you wanted to stop it, you had to make sure it stayed dead, like really dead. Now, you might be wondering, how does this Slavic nightmare connect to modern horror? Well, the answer lies in the core themes of the Upir. Undead creatures, blood-sucking entities, life force extraction, all of these elements form the bedrock of what we now think of as a vampire mythology. And while we often associate those creatures with figures like Count Dracula, the Upir's influence is undeniable. Like, think about it. The idea of a monster that comes back from the grave, feeding on the living, and cursed to roam the earth. This is classic vampire lore. The Upir is a precursor to those ideas, setting the stage for legendary figures like Nosferatu and, of course, Dracula. But there's something particularly haunting about the Upir. It wasn't just about blood. It was about draining life itself, leaving victims hollow, broken, and forever altered. And it doesn't stop there. The Upir taps into a much deeper fear, our fear of death, of what lies beyond the grave, and the consequences of a restless spirit. In a way, it's more of a reminder that death isn't always the end. It's a return, a cycle that can continue to torment us long after we've left this earth. And it's no wonder that creatures like the Upir have had a lasting influence on the horror genre. Whether it's a haunted graveyard, an ancient curse, or an undead monster stalking the living, their legacy continues to haunt us in countless ways. Now, let's talk about one of the most famous witches in folklore. We're going to take a shift from vampires now and talk about some witchery. Let's focus on Baba Yaga. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Baba Yaga, you're in for a treat with this one, because it isn't your typical fairy tale witch. Picture this. There's an old woman, wild and unkempt, living in a hut that stands on chicken legs, and it's a hut that moves. And if that's not unsettling enough, her home can spin around at will, as if it's alive. But here's the thing about Baba Yaga. She's not just some malicious crone out to eat children. In many stories, she can either be a force of evil or even a mysterious guide, depending how you approach her. She embodies a kind of moral ambiguity, making her one of the most complex figures in folklore. Is she a villain, or is she a wise figure with secrets that could change everything? That answer isn't so simple. Baba Yaga is a true figure of contradictions. She's often depicted with a sharp nose, jagged teeth, and a fearsome appearance that can send shivers down her spine. But here's where it gets interesting. She's not purely evil. In some stories, if you're clever enough and prove your worth, Baba Yaga will actually help you. But if you're unprepared or disrespectful, she could easily turn on you, leading you into traps or something even worse. Her home, that infamous hut on chicken legs I was talking about, is one of the most memorable elements of her myth. Imagine a house that moves completely at will, a symbol of her control over space and nature. And it's not just any hut. It's often described as turning itself around by uttering a magical incantation. Think about that for a second. Her house is just as unpredictable as she is. So let's break down what Baba Yaga has to do with horror. First off, Baba Yaga represents the fear of the unknown. She's tied to forces beyond human understanding. Her magical powers are deeply connected to nature, things humans can't control. And this taps into one of the most primal fears in horror, the idea that there are things out there in the world that we just can't comprehend. Whether it's a malevolent spirit or an ancient being like Baba Yaga, horror thrives on the unknown. It's the dark corner of the room that we can't see into, the monster lurking just beyond the veil of reality. Like, I can think of 5 horror movies off the top of my head, like Halloween, that totally focus on that fear of the unknown. You don't know who Michael Myers truly is. You don't know what's behind that mask. You don't know what his intentions are. It's those movies that create the true horror that stand the test of time. Second, let's talk about isolation and entrapment. Baba Yaga lives in her isolated hut, surrounded by the wilderness, removed from the world of men. That sense of isolation is something that resonates with horror. We've all been there, right? Trapped in a place we can't escape, caught under the influence of something we can't outsmart or outrun, whether that's emotionally or figuratively or actually legitimately. Horror plays with that fear of entrapment. Whether it's a haunted house, a cursed village, or a moving hut perched on chicken legs, no one is safe whenever Baba Yaga's involved. Now let's also discuss Baba Yaga's influence on the witch archetype. Baba Yaga is one of the earliest representations of the witch in folklore, and her legacy can be seen in nearly every witch in horror that came after her. Whether it's the creepy old witches in Macbeth, the horrific witchcraft that we see in the 2015 film The Witch, or even the mysterious and ominous figures in films like The Blair Witch Project. Baba Yaga laid the groundwork for all of these characters that we continue to see in modern horror and Shakespearean tales. What makes her stand out so much in the horror genre is how she's not just a wicked witch, she's someone who holds wisdom. Her magic is ancient and primal, tapping into, forces that are beyond human understanding. But it's that duality, whether it's benevolent or evil, that makes her such an influential figure in horror. It's that balance between power and malevolence that defines many of the witches and supernatural beings that we see today in modern horror. But Baba Yaga's influence doesn't end there. Her role in folklore has evolved across cultures, and we can still see echoes of her in popular media today. For example, Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Baba Yaga appears as an ancient being who holds immense power. She's not just a relic of the past, she's a force that continues to shape the present. And then you look at a film like John Wick. We've seen references to Baba Yaga as a feared assassin, further cementing her as an archetype that continues to terrify and have a sense of intrigue. In short, Baba Yaga's influence on the horror genre, it's undeniable. She's the embodiment of the unknown, the terrifying idea that forces exist beyond our control. She's also one of the earliest examples of the witch figure in horror, which has paved the way for countless characters that mix mystery, power, and fear. And whether she's helping or harming, there's no denying that Baba Yaga remains one of the most terrifying figures in folklore today. Now, next up, from the forest to the water, we have Rusalka, vengeful spirits of drowned women. You might be picturing a beautiful woman, in this case, emerging from the depths of a lake or river, luring unsuspecting travelers to their watery graves. You're not that far off if that's what you're thinking. But who or what are these eerie beings? And how have they influenced the horror genre as we know it today? Well, the Rusalka is a water spirit from Slavic mythology, most commonly associated with death, the supernatural, and, of course, water. These spirits are said to be the souls of young women who met tragic ends, often by drowning or suicide. But what makes them so terrifying is that they aren't just the spirits of the dead. They're dangerous, vengeful, and restless. So let's picture this. A misty river at night, air heavy with an unnatural stillness. There's a haunting beauty to that kind of scene, right? And then from the depths, a figure appears, dressed in flowing white, her long hair flowing underwater, and her face pale, but hauntingly beautiful. This is a Rusalka, and she is here for one reason, to avenge her untimely death. But what exactly makes a woman become a Rusalka? In the folklore, these spirits are said to be the souls of young women who died tragically, maybe in a drowning accident or from childbirth or even suicide, especially though in the spring and summer seasons. But their death isn't the end. It's actually only the beginning of their torment. Their appearance can vary, depending on the tale that you hear. In some stories, she's a breathtakingly beautiful woman, luring men to their doom with her seductive charm. In others, she's a decayed skeletal figure, her beauty ravaged by the passage of time. But one thing always remains constant with their folklore. She's a spirit trapped between life and death, unable to find peace. And in folklore, these spirits aren't just harmless ghosts. They're often seen as vengeful entities. Their souls are restless. They seek out the living to drown them, either by drowning them in the same waters where they met their own demise, or by luring them into the watery depths. In some stories, they might even target men who wronged them in life, often exacting a cruel revenge. This brings us to the horror genre. In the world of horror, they've become an archetype that brings together several chilling elements: death, vengeance, and the fear of the unknown. The idea of a seductive, deadly spirit is nothing new to horror fans. From sirens to ghosts, we've seen countless stories where beautiful women are portrayed as dangerous, often leading men to their doom. But these guys have a unique twist. Her tragedy makes her both a victim and a villain. And it's this duality that makes the Rusalka a perfect fit for horror storytelling. She embodies the classic theme of the vengeful spirit, the idea that the dead don't rest easily, especially when they've been wronged. The Rusalka's watery domain is also a liminal space. It's a place where the living and the dead collide, where a simple swim can turn into a deadly one. And that's not all. The setting for many of these Rusalka stories is just as important as the spirit herself. Think about it. The murky, fog-covered lakes, the dark, silent rivers, these environments evoke a sense of isolation and dread into their victims. They're places where life and death intermingle, and the boundary between the two is super thin. It's the perfect backdrop for horror, where the waters might hide the body of a dead lover or Rusalka waiting for her next victim. You can see the influence of them in modern horror in a variety of ways. On the big screen, horror films often feature aquatic spirits and ghosts inspired by them. From ghost stories to urban legends, the idea of the spirit that haunts water is something that taps into a deep primal fear. The allure of the Rusalka is both seductive and dangerous. She represents the deep, the unknown, and the tragic consequences of longing for something that might not be meant for you. And it's not just film either. These haunting spirits have also made their way into literature and even video games. They appear as mysterious entities, sometimes driven by a need for vengeance, and sometimes just seeking to claim what is theirs, whether it's justice, rest, or even love. Their ability to shift between the role of victim and villain is really what keeps the Rusalka at the heart of many horror stories. Now we're going to shift into the dense, untamed forest of Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia. There's a name there that sends a chill down the spine of anyone brave enough to venture into the wild. That name is Leshy, a forest spirit, a guardian of the trees who's a shapeshifter and as mischievous as he is dangerous. Now, the Leshy isn't your average woodland creature. Imagine a tall figure, taller than a man, but not quite human. Some say his skin is like bark, hair like moss, and his eyes, well, they're said to be the color of the forest itself. But here's the thing. The Leshy has the ability to blend into his surroundings, making him almost impossible to see until it's too late. He can shapeshift into any animal, tree, or even the forest itself. One moment he could appear as a towering figure. The next he's just another old oak tree. And it's no wonder this creature is a trickster. He'll lead you astray, make you lose your way, and maybe even have a little fun with your mind. There's some versions of the story where the Leshy can grow or shrink in size, either towering over people or making himself so small that you can't even tell if he's real. Picture walking through the woods, lost in the beauty of nature, when suddenly you hear a voice, but there's no one there. Or worse, you catch a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of your eye. Is it just the wind? Or is it the Leshy watching you from the shadows? But the Leshy isn't just playing games. He's a guardian too. If you harm the forest, chop down the trees, or disrespect the sacred land, you might find yourself face to face with this creature's wrath. The Leshy is actually known for punishing those who threaten the forest's balance, sometimes leading them deeper into the woods, never to be seen again. And here's where things get even creepier. The Leshy is said to have a strange connection with those who entered his domain. If you're a traveler lost in the forest, it's not uncommon to think that you've stumbled into an unfamiliar part of the woods, but then you realize you've actually been walking in circles. The Leshy might be toying with you at this point, hiding paths and confusing your senses, but what he really does is make you feel like you're losing touch with reality. And this spirit's malevolence doesn't end there. In some stories, the Leshy takes on a more sinister role, transforming into a beast or a monstrous figure that haunts the unwary. Sometimes he even appears as a wolf, a bear, or even a wild boar. And in those rare moments when you meet him eye to eye, it's said that the Leshy's gaze can freeze you in place and paralyze you with fear. But not all of the Leshy stories are about pure terror. There are also tales of the Leshy helping lost travelers who show respect for the land, guiding them to safety, or at least allowing them to find their way back home. But don't think you can count on that. This creature thrives on unpredictability, and showing kindness to him could be just as dangerous as angering him. Now, the Leshy's influence on horror has been profound. The idea of a malevolent being that resides in the wilderness, whose motives are unclear and whose power is beyond understanding, is a concept that's inspired countless horror stories and films. The idea of forests being a place of supernatural terror, where the very environment seems to turn against you, can be traced back to these ancient tales. You can see the echoes of the Leshy in movies like The Blair Witch Project, where the forest becomes a maze, kind of like a psychological prison, as unseen forces begin to torment the characters. There's also Silent Hill video games, which tap into this primal fear of being lost in an unnatural, hostile environment, where the lines between reality and nightmare are blurred. The Leshy isn't just a trickster. He's a reminder that there are forces in nature that are beyond human control, and that in itself is terrifying. Now, all these spirits that we've talked about, I know they're evil, I know they're terrifying, but not all spirits were evil. Some, like the Domovoi, were protectors. The Domovoi is a household spirit. It's deeply embedded in Slavic folklore. They're known as the guardian of the home, and this spirit is said to watch over the family, ensuring peace, health, and prosperity. However, if you disrespect the home or neglect your duties, the Domovoi may show a darker side. You see, the Domovoi isn't just any spirit. It's believed to be the spirit of an ancestor, dwelling near the hearth, which is the heart of the home. If you treat your home with care and respect, the Domovoi will protect it, without you even knowing that it's there. But the moment you forget to sweep the corners, leave a plate dirty overnight, or even disturb the peace of your family, that's when the Domovoi takes on its darker form. And it might start with a strange noise, like a thud or a scratch on the walls. Then it'll escalate into things like misfortune, illness, or something even worse. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Domovoi's ability to shapeshift. It's said that they've appeared as an old man, a cat, or sometimes even a dog. But if you were to spot it in the dark, that is where the real horror lies. You may never know when the Domovoi is there. You might think it's just your imagination, but the house's atmosphere will have like an eerie, cold feeling in the air, and it'll tell a different story. If the Domovoi isn't pleased, you can expect a night of terror, or even something far more sinister. This spirit's dual nature of protection and malice is what makes it so terrifying. It plays on one of our deepest fears, that the things we trust the most, and the things that can protect us, can also hurt us. It's the perfect reflection of the home, a place that can feel both safe and unsafe, depending on what's inside. But the Domovoi doesn't just haunt old houses or ghost stories. No, its presence stretches far into modern horror. Because think about it, what could be scarier than a familiar place, like your own home, and then have it turn against you? Movies and books have picked up on this fear time and time again, blending folklore with psychological horror to create something truly unsettling. We'll take the 2015 film The Witch as another example. While the Domovoi isn't featured explicitly in this film, its influence is unmistakable. The feeling that something or someone is watching you from the shadows of the home. It's that same feeling we get when folklore like the Domovoi creeps into our consciousness, that our sanctuary could turn into a nightmare. And it's not just films either. Writers have taken inspiration from the Domovoi to craft stories where the house itself is alive, constantly judging and punishing. The Domovoi is a pure representation of the fear of a house that knows your deepest secrets. And if you don't respect it, well, it might just make sure that you never sleep again. But here's the real horror. The Domovoi is a part of us. It's about our relationships with the places we call home, the people we live with, and the history that we carry with us. In some ways, it's not just a spirit, but it's actually a mirror of our own fears. And now we're going to move into Romania with the Moroi, an undead being more ghostly than the Strigoi that we were talking about earlier. The Moroi in Romanian folklore are creatures of the night, spirits of the dead who refuse to stay buried. They're not the flesh and blood vampires that we read about in modern fiction. The Moroi are ethereal, undead entities that rise from their graves and haunt the living. They're often seen as blood drinkers. These spirits, though, feast on the life essence of the living, and their return from the grave is a harbinger of death and misfortune. In Romanian mythology, the term Moroi can describe two things. First, the undead spirits of the deceased, those who come back to life to cause chaos. Also, they can be looked at as the living who are believed to be possessed by vampiric traits, like pale skin, red eyes, or an unnatural attraction to the blood of others. Now, you may be wondering, where have I heard this before? Well, if you've ever read Bram Stoker's Dracula, or if you've ever watched Interview with the Vampire, you've experienced the legacy of creatures like the Moroi. The folklore from Romania, and specifically the Moroi, have heavily influenced modern-day understanding of vampires. The Moroi and other creatures of Romanian myth, like the Strigoi, laid the foundation for much of what we recognize as vampire mythology. It's the idea of spirits returning from the grave, drinking blood, and living in on the darkness. That's straight out of Romanian lore. And this haunting image has inspired generations of storytellers and filmmakers to craft the blood-drinking fiends that we know today. The concept of death and resurrection is also at the core of the Moroi legend. Think about it. In so many modern vampire stories, the undead are either cursed to walk the earth for eternity, or they're in search of some sort of way to break their curse. The Moroi's return from the grave symbolizes that eternal battle between life and death, light and darkness, something that has resonated nonstop through the horror genre. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about the impact that the Moroi has had on the genre and pop culture. We see traces of these kinds of Romanian myths in films like Nosferatu, The Lost Boys, even in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and The Vampire Diaries. The way vampires are portrayed in modern media, whether it's as tragic anti-heroes or ruthless predators, it can be traced back to the chilling legends of the Moroi. And it's not just in vampires. The eerie presence of the Moroi in horror fiction adds an extra layer of dread. It's that lingering feeling that something is out there, stalking us from the shadows. Their return from death speaks to our deepest fears of the unknown, and the afterlife, and the power of the supernatural. Now, another terrifying creature on this list is the Drekavac. It's said that these creatures are the ghost of an unbaptized child. Now, this name might not be familiar to many outside of the Balkans, but once you hear the story, you'll never forget it. It originates from the haunted forests and graveyards of Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia. The Drekavac is a creature that has terrified generations with its blood-curdling scream and its eerie, ghostly presence. It's translated to the Screamer. The Drekavac is a monstrous figure that, according to folklore, is the restless spirit of an unbaptized or improperly buried child. So imagine that, a creature born out of grief and anger, roaming the earth with a shriek that could drive a person mad. It's said to be pale, emaciated, and twisted, with glowing eyes that pierce through the dark. But what really makes the Drekavac so terrifying is its wail. It's a sound so unnerving that anyone who hears it is said to fall ill or even die. It's a spirit completely driven by rage, seeking out the living in remote graveyards, dark forests, and abandoned places. Now, let's talk about how this creature has left its mark on horror, particularly in literature, film, and games. The Drekavac taps into a primal fear of death and the supernatural. Its connection to the spirits of the dead, especially the souls of children, has inspired countless horror stories. It's a perfect example of how folklore gives rise to modern fears. You see, the Drekavac isn't just a monster. It's a reflection of our own anxieties about death, the afterlife, and the consequences of not following tradition. If you take a look at films like The Witch, or even Silent Hill, both of these works carry echoes of the Drekavac in their dark, atmospheric settings. There's something about the idea of a supernatural force that haunts us, that warns us of death, and that screams into the night, leaving us on edge. This isn't just a creature, it's a symbol of our greatest fears. In fact, the influence of the Drekavac can really be seen in Silent Hill. The series is a prime example where monsters are not just physical threats, but also psychological ones. The Drekavac, in a way, embody the essence of that fear. The fear of the unseen and the unknowable, and the wailing presence of death itself. You could also see this in games like The Witcher. The grotesque and wailing forms of creatures also seem to draw from that similar folklore, making the Drekavac's spirit live on in a new interactive form. And beyond films and games, the Drekavac has left its mark on music, books, and art. Its chilling wail and twisted form have inspired artists who draw on that ancient fear of the supernatural. If you've ever watched a horror movie with a soundscape that seems to play with eerie whispers and cries in the distance, chances are it's channeling something very much like the Drekavac. So why does the Drekavac continue to haunt us even today? Maybe it's because it represents that dark place in all of us, the fear of what happens after we die, the terror of spirits left behind. It taps into those universal fears that transcend time, place, and culture. The wail of the Drekavac is the wail of lost souls, or the consequences of neglect and the unknown. Now, you can't talk about folklore and not talk about folk magic and its superstitions, because folklore isn't just about monsters. It's about the magic used to protect against them. There's the evil eye. It's an ancient belief found in folklore all over the world. It's the idea that someone can curse or harm you simply by looking at you with envy, jealousy, or malice. This is a simple yet sinister concept that has deep roots in Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Latin American cultures. And today, it's a very powerful symbol in the horror genre. The evil eye is often described as the ability to cause bad luck or misfortune, usually through a single look. It's believed that people with an envious or hateful stare can unknowingly bring illness, accidents, or even death to their victim. And for many, this is an unavoidable curse. It's an unseen, malevolent force creeping into your life with no warning. And that's where the horror really gets interesting. The concept of the evil eye has always been a perfect fit for psychological terror. It taps into one of our deepest, most primal fears, the fear of being watched, or even worse, controlled. Imagine someone having the power to ruin your life, not through physical violence, but simply just by looking at you. The idea that something so subtle and so invisible could bring your downfall is downright terrifying. And many horror films and stories tap into this deep unease. The evil eye doesn't need to be seen to be felt. And often it's not just the person doing the cursing that makes it scary, it's the helplessness of the victim. In horror, this plays out in chilling ways. A character might suddenly fall ill, suffer accidents, or experience strange occurrences, all of which could be attributed to the unseen force of the evil eye. For example, in supernatural horror, we've all seen stories where characters are haunted by dark, invisible forces, whether that's ghosts, spirits, or even demonic entities. The evil eye works in a similar way. The victim is cursed, and this curse grows stronger over time. It's almost like being haunted, but in a way that's uniquely personal and insidious. And of course, it has a connection to witchcraft and magic. Many cultures associate the evil eye with witchcraft, whether it's the belief that someone can hex you with a single glance, or that an object, like an amulet or a talisman, is needed to ward off the curse. These elements of black magic and dark rituals are often central to horror stories that explore the evil eye, blending folklore with supernatural horror. And as horrors evolved over the centuries, so has the concept of the evil eye. It's not just about curses anymore. It's about control, jealousy, and societal fears. In modern horror, the evil eye can be a metaphor for the hidden dangers that lie in plain sight, whether it's the malevolent gaze of a stranger or the envy of someone close to you. Think of psychological thrillers, where characters start to unravel, haunted by someone they can't quite pinpoint, yet who has the power to ruin their lives without even touching them. So whether it's supernatural or psychological horror, the evil eye has had a lasting influence on the genre. It brings to life our fears of being controlled by an invisible, malicious force. It's unsettling because it makes us question everything around us, the way we interact with others, the way we're constantly being watched, and the possibility that some of us might not even realize we're the ones being cursed. And many of these legends have shaped horror as we know it, from Dracula and Nosferatu to supernatural horror films about vengeful spirits and demonic forests. Central and Eastern European folklore continues to inspire nightmares. If these tales have left you looking over your shoulder, you're definitely not alone. I want to thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Cabin of Horrors podcast. We've dived deep into some ancient mythology and talked about how it's continued to impact modern horror to this day. And this is only part one. Next week, we will be continuing to talk about European folklore. There is so much ground to cover when it comes to European folklore. We've only just tipped on the surface. So come back next week. Make sure to subscribe on wherever you're listening to this. That way you get the notification when the episode goes live. And we'll be talking about more terrifying European folklore.